Well, this is a very serious matter and one I don't think has had enough attention in the West. But we have an expert who we call on every time we need to decrypt what's going on in China. And he's written an essay just a couple days ago in the Gatestone Institute called China Adopts Malicious Cyber Security Rules. And you know who I'm talking about. It's our old friend Gordon G. Chang who joins us now via Skype. Gordon, great to see you again. I always encourage our followers to follow you on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang. Tell me what's going on with the new rules passed yesterday and the ones that will take effect on January 1st.
Yeah, these two measures, December 1, which is the implementation of the multi-level protection scheme 2.0, and on January 2, the cryptography law goes into effect. These two measures will make all the data, communications, informations that foreign companies store on their China networks available to Chinese authorities. So there will be no more encryption permitted, at least encryption that is from the Chinese government and the Communist Party. And this really means that China will be able to take this information and, for instance, give it to state enterprises that compete against foreign companies. It also means that foreign companies may lose around the world their trade secret protections for information that they store on their China networks. And China will use this to ruin these companies, just like it ruined Nortel Networks, which is now bankrupted. So this is a matter where China is in a position really to take over foreign companies, not just in China, but elsewhere around the world.
So how would that impact a high-tech company? I'm just going to pick an example. Let's just say, I don't know, Apple computers. How would Apple or Apple users or Apple designers be at risk? How would China use these laws to get access to things? I'm just using that as an example.
Yeah, well, Apple would have to turn over encryption keys to the Chinese government, which means everything on their networks in China is visible to the Chinese government. And by the way, this is not a situation where Apple, after a request or a demand, would turn over information to Beijing. This Beijing would be able to take it on its own because there is no encryption with regard to the Chinese government. So this means just everything is there. And it also means, Ezra, because the Chinese are in the networks of Apple, they probably are in a better position to rummage around Apple's networks outside China. So, you shouldn't be surprised within, a decade that Apple is owned by China. This is serious because, we saw this with Nortel. This is not some sort of theoretical concern. This has already happened to a major multinational.
Yeah, Nortel used to be the Canadian high-tech champion until it was undone in exactly the manner you suggest. Now, in the past, companies like Apple have fought against the US government trying to get backdoor access to their encryption, and I respect that. They've even done so in cases involving terrorism, which shows their dedication. I haven't seen an outcry from Silicon Valley about Chinese decryption efforts. Have I just missed it, or how has Silicon Valley reacted?
Well, China is a lot more coercive than the United States. And so they realize that there's no point in trying to publicly oppose Beijing's efforts. And so they don't. They're trading information for access. Companies have done this for quite some time, not very many of them successful. And that's why there is this difference of approach that companies take to Beijing as opposed to the approach they take to Washington. And this is despicable. This is horrible. But it's in the context of business understandable. And it's up to countries like Canada and the United States to change the incentives for those companies so that they are not subject to pressure by Beijing, which unfortunately means not only reducing their vulnerability to China, but getting them out of China. And this is terrible, Ezra, but remember, Ottawa, Washington, London, we're not driving this. It's Beijing that's driving this.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's concerned me, it's the 1-year anniversary of when the daughter of the founder of Huawei, who's also the CFO, was arrested transiting through Vancouver. So she's been under house arrest. It's been the 1-year anniversary. This was the spark of a degradation of relations between China and Canada. But since the last federal election up here, Gordon, I see that Canada is becoming softer towards China. The new foreign minister, very pro-China, has even appeared on Chinese state TV saying China is a model of security and stability. We see a number of foreign policy statements about we need a new framework with China, we want to patch things up. I'm worried that Canada is collapsing towards China, and in particular, I see that Huawei is on a PR offensive in Canada. In fact, Canada has allowed Huawei to build networks in the northern Arctic, which I would think is a strategic military and industrial network. Let me ask you this. Huawei, if we allow Huawei to build telecom infrastructure in Canada, could that be used under these Chinese laws to suck out data and information and secrets, just letting the hardware be put in place in Canada?
Yeah, Beijing would be certainly in a position to do that, not under the December 1 and January 1 measures, which only applied to networks in China. But China, with Huawei in the backbone of Canada's telecommunications networks, clearly would be able to do exactly what you say, which is why the United States is in the process of removing Huawei from the American backbone. This is important because Canada's a Five Eyes partner. But if it has Huawei 5G networks, I don't think the United States should be cooperating with Canada. And this whole drift that you're talking about of Canada becoming a Chinese colony is really most worrisome.
You know, Susan Rice, Barack Obama's former national security advisor, came up to Canada and warned Canada about doing business with Huawei. I thought that was remarkable, considering, the source. I mean, she's no friend of Donald Trump, and for her to take the American line in Canada was quite interesting. Let me shift gears a little bit. I follow you very closely on Twitter because you're the master of what's going on these days with China and Hong Kong. Can you give us your assessment of the last month in Hong Kong leading up to the election? We had our reporter Kian Bexty there, and he found it eye-opening and wondrous, but terrifying too. What's your take on the election, its results, and what Beijing is going to do next?
Well, Beijing just a few hours ago told the U.S. Navy it could no longer have Hong Kong port calls. And this to me showed the weakness of China, because China wasn't sanctioning the United States, it was sanctioning itself. Those port calls are important to the economy of Hong Kong. When a carrier strike group pulls into Hong Kong waters, that's $5 million for the Hong Kong economy, within those 3 or 4 days. So really right now you see Beijing pulling a temper tantrum, but not being able to actually do something effective against the United States. And we see, just in general, Beijing, after the district council elections of 2 Sundays ago, basically doesn't know what to do. They were actually thinking that their pro-Beijing candidates would pick up seats in those district council elections where, the pro-Beijing camp got annihilated. Yeah. They had control of all 18 district councils before the election. Now they've only got control of one. And the only reason why they have the control of that one is because it's dominated by government-appointed members. So, China right now is just struggling in terms of trying to figure out what to do in Hong Kong.
Well, that's fascinating because, in repressive or authoritarian or one-party regimes, no one likes to tell the emperor about his new clothes. No one wants to be the dissenter. I just watched the miniseries on Chernobyl, and what struck me, I know it was a dramatization, but I think they nailed it. In a Soviet-style system, no one wants to tell the boss he's wrong. So I can only imagine, despite them being able to watch the free press in Hong Kong, they preferred to believe their own PR, their own spies who said, "Oh, President Xi, you're beloved in Hong Kong. This is just American meddling." I was shocked that China got it so wrong. Are they really that disconnected from reality?
I was really surprised by how out of touch the senior leadership in Beijing is. Because you're exactly right. The lower level Chinese officials knew, I'm sure, exactly what was going to happen. Everybody knew the polling before the election. There was going to be a sweep. And for senior Chinese leaders not to know that shows the fundamental failure of their system, that there's that disconnect. And it's for the reason you say, that everyone is afraid of Xi Jinping. This is a authoritarian system becoming totalitarian very fast.
Let me ask you one last question. In the few days before the elections, there was sort of a siege of Pauli University. Some students were holed up there and some pretty heavily armed police outside. And some of the students were using bows and arrows. And they were using some little high-tech MacGyver gizmos, no real firearms. And, part of me thought, well, look at their ingenuity. But most of me thought, oh my God, bows and arrows, they're going to be annihilated if this goes Tiananmen Square style. And I actually was extremely sad to see that's all they got. I mean, that's dramatic, but that's a desperate last stand. Well, those guys won. The pro-democracy students won. But if Beijing rolls in the tanks, bows and arrows aren't going to work. Are you still afraid that Beijing could play the Tiananmen Square brutal force card like they did against the democracy movement that fateful day in Tiananmen Square?
Well, it's possible that they do it, but I think that from a military point of view, it would be a disaster for China. There would be casualties, but there'd be casualties on both sides, because we know from all we've seen over the last 5 months that those kids are willing to die. They're good fighters. For the most part, they have outfoxed the police. Their only tactical defeat was at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, as you point out. But it was actually a political success because it convinced the U.S. Congress to vote for those 2 pieces of legislation that President Trump signed on Wednesday. And, if the Chinese formally deploy their troops or their police on Hong Kong streets, those kids are going to rain down explosives and petrol bombs on Chinese troops. They're going to disappear into apartment buildings. This is, remember, a guerrilla force that is supported by almost 90% of the population of Hong Kong. And if the Chinese invade, that 90% is going to be 95, 96, 97% support of the people, which really means that it's extremely difficult to beat a guerrilla force that is supported by the people. We Americans should know that. It's called Vietnam. I hope the Chinese understand what's going on, because if they were to formally deploy, they'd be bringing back a lot of their troops in body bags.
Wow. Well, God forbid it comes to that. We're just so proud of the Hong Kong democracy activists. I truly think they're an example for the world of people standing up for principles that I think used to be called Western liberal values, but now Hong Kong has much of a claim to those values as anyone else in the world. I think they're the leaders in it. And Gordon, I thank you for being such an attentive observer and pundit on these matters. We rely on you so much, and we're always grateful for your time on TV.
Well, thank you so much, Ezra. It's really great what you're doing, and especially with those very troublesome developments in Ottawa. Your voice is so critical at this moment.
Well, it's nice of you to say. We'll keep at it. And folks, I wanted to say again, if you're not following Gordon on Twitter, he's a must follow. You can do that at Gordon G. Chang, and we'll put his Twitter handle on the screen. Take care, my friend. Keep up the fight.
Thanks, Ezra.
Right on. There you have it, Gordon G. Chang. That's an excerpt from the Ezra Levant Show, which is a show I do every day. I do a monologue, interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. But you've got to subscribe to it, which you can do at premium.rebelnews.com.